Klayton. Welcome to World Building Secrets.
Thanks, Zuzy. Thanks for
So
having me.
great to have you. I need to ask you just purely to give us a little insight about your background, because I know everybody watching is going to comment what on earth is happening behind you. And I think for anyone that isn't in the music space, looks like a bunch of wires and buttons.
This is the transport for my new spaceship. So this is what
to the universe.
Planet Earth, which is completely insane right now. So I'm building this so I can get the hell out of here. These are your, for the most part, right here. These are your rack modules. They're all different things. They do different things, and that's the beauty of it. All these cables, which really right now there's not many of them. There's normally like a lot more, and this is just one case out of 3 that I have, plus a bunch of other. Like I'm looking at a bunch of gear in racks that aren't even going in here. So I have a lot of this kind of stuff. And like you can see a cassette deck right here. It's like they're very boutique. They do specific things. But the beauty of them is that you can patch one thing to another using a cable, and you can see all the variety you have here. So you never ever get the same sound twice. And that has really shaped my production style. For probably over 10 years, 12 years. I think 2012 maybe. Yes. 2012 might have been when I first got into Eurorack. But there it is. I really put it in. This is a temporary workspace for me, as my new studio is probably a month or 2 from being completely built. So this was here just to help me keep my sanity. I needed some semblance of something musical around me besides beige carpet and beige walls and a mess everywhere. You know?
I totally understand. It's refreshing to see actual physical, like musical hardware, engineering hardware. You know, I don't think there's a lot of artists that really take advantage, or I mean, you don't need that anymore, right? Technically, but
no, you don't need it. This is not a need thing for me. This is totally a want thing. This is a preference. But I can say that I do make different music when I'm using this versus clicking the mouse. There's no question.
It reminds me of Dead Mouse's studio, because he says the exact same thing and does the exact same thing, and he's like, you don't need it, but there's so much out there for you to use, and if you don't take advantage of it, like that's how you can make your sound just different, unlike anyone else, because you can have that creative control.
That's the thing I felt in music, is that a lot of it gets so homogenized when you're in a genre and everybody in that genre is just using a computer with the same software. Really, things tend to start sounding very much the same. They're using the same drum samples, synth sounds. And I have always kind of fought against that. I've never really cared about what anybody else does anyway. So I just found my own path through my own career, managed to survive. I don't really know how, but I lived through it. And, you know, success, quote in air quotes, but successful on some level enough where this is my job. My job is what you see around me. This is what I do.
I have to ask you, where did the name Celldweller come from?
Short answer, my mom. Long answer, yeah, because I spend a lot of time in the cellar. Like when I got into music, my parents were some of the only parents that I knew that were cool enough to be like, you can play musical instruments. And you know, we lived in a fairly small house in New York and wasn't very well insulated. And my first instrument was the drums, and my mom was responsible. She was a hairstylist. Someone at the salon had a son who had some beat up, really cheap drum set. She wanted to get rid of it, out of the house. Asked my mom if any of her kids wanted it. She came home and asked me, and I'm like, I cannot believe my mom's asked me if I wanted a drum kit. It was like my dream. So I get this drum kit. I set it all up the wrong way, and that was the beginning of me basically making music and cutting my musical teeth in the cellar. I spent all of my time. I had no social life. All I cared about was reading manuals and learning about the very small amount of tech that I had. I had one sampler. I had maybe a guitar and an amp, very cheap amp, and a 4-track. And eventually I got a Mac Classic computer. And so I would spend all my time down there, and my mother would come down and be like, you need to get out of the cellar. You need to go smell the roses, live life. And I'm like, I am. This is what I want to do. And life. She would call me a cellar dweller. So she'd always call me a cellar dweller. And as time passed, one of my albums, I wrote a song called Hell Dweller. And I would just imagine, you know, somebody dwelling in hell, not literal hell, but you know, maybe a mental hell, whatever. And when it came time for me years later, not even to start a new project, I started doing producing, and I wanted a production name, and I was like, how about Celldweller? Like somebody who dwells in a cell, who's like caged and trapped. And again, it was a mental analogy, not necessarily but whatever. I didn't care who got it. And then when it came time for me to actually create a new moniker and start producing, Celldweller was the natural extension.
That's really cool. I think it's also awesome that your parents were so cool with you doing music, especially, you know, even now I have friends who, you know, whose parents are not particularly cool with it. I can imagine, you know, a few years ago,
Yeah.
not many people could do it. Even me, like I had friends when I was choosing to go to school, they're like, I still would get the response of like, you're going to music school? Like, are you sure?
Right. You know, friends and family both saw me struggling, saw me starving, failing, you know, and I tell the story often, but one of my closest friends, he started at MTV, working at MTV the same time I got my first record deal. So our paths kind of went like this. As he grew up the ranks, I you know, toured in a van. You know, I don't know what I did. It wasn't a great story. It wasn't anything glamorous, but at some point he called me and he's like, man, because I did everything myself because nobody else could do it and I couldn't afford to pay somebody. So back then, creating my own website, I learned HTML. I learned how to actually code in HTML. I didn't want to, I just needed to. So I did it. And what I came up with, you know, he saw it and was like, man, I could get you a job at MTV doing websites. You could make good money. You don't need to starve. And I was like, man, you know, I love you, but I'm not taking you up on that. Like, I need to see this through. When I'm dead, if I failed and I'm dead, then I know I'll have to throw in the towel. But until I'm dead, the only way forward for me is this way. I'm not going back. The risk, and it was painful, and it was a lot of you know, failure and mistakes and starvation, but that got me to where I'm at now, and I'm fortunate to say that I do what I love.
That's me. I really respect that, and I think, you know, that's a dilemma any artist faces: is do I dedicate myself 100% to this and, you know, sacrifice, whether it's being a starving artist or not having the, you know, security of a comfortable lifestyle or comfortable life. So I think, you know, I really respect you doing that, because
that's what it requires. And the advice that I give to people that ask me, I've had people that I recruited for band members for live shows and other musicians that come and ask opinions, and it's like, you have to sacrifice or you're not ever going to succeed. If you think you're going to just hang out with your friends all the time and whatever it is that you do, and then poke at making music, or, you know, on and off, you're never going to succeed. This takes your full attention. Basically all your thought process goes into this. Like you know, I was habitually single, you know, I would date, but I would date girls that were like states away. So that like I'd go see them for like a few days and then I'd be months by myself. So I like that, because talk on the phone and then I get off the phone and I'm like right back at work. The reward comes when there's success, when you have victories and you're like, oh my God, this worked. I can't believe this actually worked. And you know, the more you stick with it, the more you'll see things like that. You'll see little victories. And I've never been, I don't know, the Spice Girls, or I don't even know who to use as an example, where you never heard, and by the next week they're everywhere selling 11 million records. Like my trajectory is very slow, but very steady. And it's very, you know, my numbers are growing and everything else. Like, and that has been the story of my whole career. There's been very few things where I go, oh my God, wow, that really put me over the top. It's just slow and steady wins the race. It's a cliche, but that sort of sums up my career.
I'm actually curious if you'll agree with this on me. You know, I mean, I'm young, I'm just starting out in the industry, but there's two things that I very quickly was fortunate enough to have people around me that kind of engraved that in my brain. Is one, you need patience. Two, you need to understand what you want, what you consider success to be. Because if you want to sell, you know, have the number one record on Billboard, that's a different story. You have a different trajectory you need to follow. And if you want to, for example, you want to go on tour and you want to have a fan base and you just want to make music and you want to be able to live off of that music, if that's all you care about, you need to have your, you know, what's your success, but also be patient and understand that does not come.
So for me, I never had that clarity. For me, I wanted to succeed, but I never really defined what my success was. Like now I look back and I know success for me has nothing to do with how many people are listening to my music or how much money I have in the bank. Success for me is doing what I'm doing right now, which is exactly what I want to be doing. That's success. If you can do whatever you want to do, and I am in the fortunate position where I get pitched gigs all the time and collaborations all the time, and I can just turn down what I don't want to do. And I can take what I just got done last week. I just wrapped up working on the new Borderlands movie. So the video game, there's a movie coming out. It's in production, and I worked on the score. Steve Jablonsky, the composer. I did all guitar, bass, drums, synth programming, textures, tones. There's going to be a lot of my stuff in this movie because I made a lot of music for it.
That's awesome. Congrats. That's really big.
But again, and it's like I told him, it's like I you know, I can take it or leave it. It's really what I want to do. And for guys like him that I like to work with,
Yeah.
I take that gig. But there are definitely times where it's like, it's just way too high maintenance for me, or I don't have the time, or whatever it is. But that to me is what defined my success. But back in my early days, I was driven, beyond driven, but I didn't actually even know what I was driving towards. It was success, but I didn't really know how to define that. You know, maybe in my mind it was like looking at the bands at the time that were on MTV, because I was cutting my teeth as a musician during the heyday of when MTV was big, you know, and it's the band you saw on MTV is who you wanted to aspire to be, because they were living the dream. Thank God it never happened to me, because a lot of those bands, nobody even wants to listen to them anymore, you know?
Yeah.
That's good advice. Knowing where you're at in your career and being able to define what your success is, that gives you an easier road. Not easy, but more clear road how to get to where you want to be.
Yeah. Not easy. I mean, I talk about this with all my friends are in the space, and it's pretty much all we talk about. It's become like, that's kind of, I've struggled to talk about other things but music. There's a point where you kind of realize, you come to terms with just how hard it is what you're doing, specifically because it's such a personal career path. It's you are the product, you are the brand, you are the business. Without you, none of what you want exists, none of what you aspire to be exists. And you know, there's so much that goes into being a musician, whether it's from your branding, from the business perspective, but creatively being in the correct mindset to produce your work, to produce work that you're proud of and that you feel comfortable with, is really difficult to balance. Like finding a balance between all these different things is very difficult.
I can tell you this, you can't have a fragile ego, because you work at McDonald's and somebody goes online and says, wow, McDonald's hamburgers suck. You don't care.
You don't
But
shit,
when you are a one man or one woman show, or even a small band, and someone goes, wow, that band sucks, or that artist sucks, they're talking about you directly. And in the beginning, that was hard. I'm glad I grew up in New York. I grew up with a pretty thick skin.
Oh yeah.
And so things didn't bother me as much as I saw it bothering some other people. But yeah, it definitely, it gets to you.
It gets to you.
And as the more it happened, the more my skin thickened, and the more the clarity of what I wanted to do was in my mind. I knew what I wanted to do, and that means that other people's opinions mattered less. And the more I succeeded, and the more I did what I wanted to do, the more opinions of other people meant nothing to me.
Meant nothing. Yeah. And I think for me, what helps a lot is just having the right people around you. Are you somebody who prefers to keep a pretty small circle of people in terms of who you work with?
Very. I don't like people. I don't like hanging out. I don't go out. I don't socialize. I don't go to live shows. I don't want to. My perfect day is a day where I am by myself. Nobody talks to me. That's the best. That was my best days, and I'm totally fine. And I've existed most of my career. I'm a Celldweller. You know, that's the definition. Just like I'm totally fine with isolation. You know, now I have 5-year-old twins, a 4-year-old. There's no isolation for me anymore. But it's cool, you know. And again, it's within the realm of something that I want to do. I enjoy it. I love it. You know, historically speaking, I've never really collaborated much. Pretty much all my albums and everything I've done is just a one-man show. I do everything myself. Producing, you know, I've worked with other producers a little bit here and there, but for the most part, I do everything myself. That's what kind of, for me, it's a puzzle that needs to be solved. A song is a puzzle that needs to be solved, and I can't rest until I've solved that puzzle. So whether it's the production of the music or the songwriting, or man, this verse is too long, or this chorus sucks, I need to make this better. Whatever the problem is, or problems, I need to solve them. And as they're solved, there's a little piece of me that goes, okay, cool, I did something. But then there's 10 more problems in front of me that I need to solve. And that's what keeps me engaged. That's what keeps me musically interested. That's what allows me to diversify, use all this crazy stuff to make cool sounds, because I never find myself being bored. But in general, my company, although we're eclipsing, I think, over 20 people now fixed. My company is a record label primarily. We're at almost over 20 people, but it really, the core of who I brainstorm with, and that it's still pretty small even within my own company. We all interact and we all interface, but everybody has their job and everybody does their thing. But me directly, I've always worked better with smaller teams, one-on-ones. I don't need to sit in a group to have people, you know, give me affirmation about, oh, you're doing great. In fact, if people are telling me too much that I'm doing great, then I probably don't want to hang out with them.
Do you share your progress of demos, for example, with people at all? Or are you someone that keeps it
probably one person that I can think of, which is James Rhodes, my manager, who was also vice president of Fix, my company. So he has built his trust with me almost 2 decades now. So
wow,
he is the only person that when I have something, even if it's rough, he's the only person that really hears it. Now, occasionally when things are far enough along, he'll know that, and he could play it in his office, and other people will walk and be like, "What is this?" I'm cool with that. That's fine. But I don't generally send my music out to anybody. I have a very specific idea of what I want to do with it. So for me, it's sending a problem out that I haven't solved.
Right.
I don't want to send the problem out into the world until I've solved it.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the idea of having, like such a huge backlog of demos that you showcase to people, and so that you get to get in the room with the right people, or you get to collaborate with the right people. That's so common. And like, it takes a lot of vulnerability to share demos like that.
And what's important, I think, from that perspective is that you're trusting the people that you're sending your music to. Like there has to be some level of trust that you're going, well, I think if I send this to them, even if I'm self-conscious about it, they're going to bring something to it that's going to make it better. And I understand that in my head. I'm so opinionated about my own music that I don't necessarily want anybody else's opinion, but I've taken it. I've definitely taken it. Why I ended up in Detroit. I went to a studio, first time I ever really worked with anybody else that way. And he ended up, teaching me a lot of things. I ended up teaching him a lot of things, but at some point I ended up trusting his opinion where I could show him a bad demo. He'd pick through, he'd polish the turd. He'd be like, okay, that part's cool, work on that. And then I would go back. And my former manager, Tyler Bacon, who owns Position Music, they're a very large licensing company, Music Sync, that kind of thing. Tyler, for many years, was that other person that I would send really terrible demos. One of my biggest songs is a song called Switchback. And the first time I ever played that riff over the phone, he said, that's going to be the riff of the year. And he didn't specify what year, and I remind him of that all the time. So thankfully, I don't know that the year has come yet, but it's been many years that riff has, for whatever it's worth, it's been used in a lot of movies, a lot of video games. It's a fan favorite for whatever reason. I don't know why. I just wrote it. It's just something I did. But yes, so keeping a very small group of people that can hear your stuff early, that you trust, that can be very valuable. And it was to me, because people like Tyler, James, Grant, they would say, this sucks, this is great. And sometimes I would listen and other times I would not, because again, having an opinion, and you could be in the same boat. If you have an opinion and you like what you do, at the end of the day, you're the artist. You have to live with that decision. So
you have to make those decisions.
Here, then that decision is yours, but you have to live with that consequence as well. So I would weigh those things. I generally react, be mad. Don't tell me my music sucks. And then I would let some steam blow off, and I would think about it and be like, you know what, he's probably right. So just to prove a point, I'd go and I'll show him, and I'm going to go write something else, and it's going to suck. And then I'd write something and it would end up being better than what I had. And then I'd have to go back and crow and admit, you were right, I was wrong.
Definitely. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about you and your music. You started from your mom's basement. Is that where Circle of Dust first came from?
No, Circle of Dust was really the first real. I played in bands, like local bands, and I was the drummer. Nobody cared about the drummer. Drummer had no say ever. So what would happen is the guitar player would go out to get a drink or whatever, and he'd leave his guitar there, and I'd pick it up and try to learn a power chord. And that's how I started learning how to play multiple instruments. And then at some point, pre-Circle of Dust, right before it, someone I knew at college had a Roland D20, which was a little synthesizer keyboard. It's terrible sounding, but back then it blew my mind, because he's like, yeah, you can program drums and a little melody and then repeat it. And then I was like, oh my God, I could write a song by myself. I don't need to talk to anybody else.
You can loop.
Exactly. So I write. And it was very, very primitive. You couldn't copy and paste. Like if I wanted to repeat a verse, I had to literally play the same thing twice. So that's why my music, I think, ultimately was so progressive. When I started making Circle of Dust music and I had more of a proper sequencer, I had become so progressive in nature because there was no copy and paste. I was literally rewriting every part over and over again. And whatever, it is what it is. But that blew my mind. That opened up my mind to this possibility. That's when I started writing demos by myself. And that was when I got it into the hands of somebody I knew from another band on the East Coast who was signed to a label. They had made him, Kurt Bachman, he was in a band called Believer. They made him the head of A&R for the label for a very short time. And in that short time, he got my demo because I knew him. And he's like, we want to sign you. And that was literally, that was
wow.
That was beginning of my career. And again, very small label, no advance, no money. The only thing I got was a sampler because I was broke. I didn't have a sampler. And this a sampler was the core of the sound I was trying to make. So my demo, I took a shortwave radio that I had and I would flip it on and off through a delay pedal on a 4-track. And that was how I got noise and, you know, the approximation of noise and different happening rhythmically. It was so bad. I can't even believe I got signed. But that was the best I could do with what I had. And then they got me a sampler and that was it. I never left. I never left the basement. I was at a manual this thick, which is sitting in this room right here. And I read that whole thing many times, learning how to use a sampler. I'd never had one before. And that was the beginning of me being a career musician. And it was a very, very tough path. But the excitement, the potential, I've never had anything like it in my life.
That's incredible. How did you
know? I didn't understand it. It was the most exciting thing in my life at that point.
It's just hearing stories like this is always so incredible how certain things are just so meant to be, and you just let it happen. And you know, it's like if you what would have happened if you didn't get that sequencer?
What would happen if I didn't get the record deal? I know what would happen. I'd be a doctor because I was pre-med and I was in college pre-med.
Really?
I was. And I knew I was like, I don't people don't want to be around them all day. Like, I don't want to do this. And so I switched my major to music for one semester. And during that semester is when I got my tape to Kurt. He brought it to the label head, Doug. Doug is like, this is cool. And they're like, we want to sign you. And I dropped out of school instantly. I'm like, I can go back to med school later. I'm trying. I need to try this. And I never looked. I never looked.
And good that you did.
You crack that door and I'm going to stick my foot in there and push it open. That's,
I think, an attitude that's what gets you far, honestly.
I didn't know. It's just how I'm built. It's just how I'm built. And not everybody is. That's definitely true.
Yeah, not everyone is. How would you describe your sound to somebody who's very new to it?
Tough one. I don't like to describe my sound, but I have 4 projects, so they all have different sounds. But Celldweller being my main, most known. Probably a mix between if Metallica and Deadmau5 had a baby. And I don't use them as references at all, but for someone who doesn't know anything, that at least puts in the world of, I get that. It's metal, EDM, industrial. It's kind of like, I do the whole ballad thing. Like I love writing songs. I love melody. I'm not just about sound design and noise, although I love sound design and sound is what moves me a lot of times. But writing a song that's memorable, melody, aggression, like there's just a combo of all that. That's from me growing up on bands like Slayer, Metallica, Anthrax, Iron Maiden, Priest. Like that's where I started. As soon as I started making music myself, probably early teens, that's when I discovered new wave, and I discovered bands like The Cure, Depeche Mode. Blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, this is not guitar, bass, and drum music. There's like the palette is so much bigger of sounds. That expanded my mind. And that's when these worlds started coming together in my mind. Like, why can't all of this kind of live together? So that's Celldweller. I have a project called Scandroid, which is basically like 80s, 90s kind of retro music. So it's like synthesizer, rock, but like kind of like 80s, 90s flavor, because this is really what I wanted to be making in the 80s and 90s, but I was totally not talented enough to do it. So I just played metal because I could do that. I can get behind a drum kit and double bass and go crazy. And then I have Circle of Dust, which was my first project really that put me on the map. That's straight up just heavy industrial music. 80s, 90s era industrial music, although I'm doing it in a much more modern way now. And then I have FreqGen. FreqGen really started as an idea of like an outcropping of this. So I would make all kinds of like atmospheres and beats and different things on this kind of stuff. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this? And I created this project, which is more of like my analog synthesizer kind of playground. And most recently, I just did a 90s flavored kind of like, I hated it, but they called it electronica in the United States, and I hated that term. It was very but bands like Prodigy and Crystal Method and Apollo 440, you name it, stuff like that was stuff I was, and trip hop, Tricky and Massive Attack, and a combo of all that kind of stuff. So my newest album for FreqGen is kind of like that flavor. So there's a lot of sounds. It's hard for me to describe in just a couple of words.
That's great. I think no, that describes it perfectly, and I think. I love that you had such a diverse background growing up listening to music, and I think diverse interest of listening to music. There's something about music from back then process of creating music back then, the way it sounds, it's just so goddamn different from music you hear today. And you don't
Absolutely.
hear music like this today. You just don't.
You do.
And
No.
like, even just understanding the history of music and trajectory of music and how it's progressed allows you just have a completely different perspective on how you make sound today. And it's so cool how you have all these different projects, but I'm just fascinated how do you differentiate yourself personally when it comes to actually creating these sounds? How do you do that? I don't.
Almost just like I described it to you. Like
Mm.
if it's in this bucket, the Celldweller bucket, it's going to be, I restrict myself to like, I want to do like heavy guitars, synthesis, like synthesizers and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But not like in an 80s, 90s retro way, just more sound design and cool stuff. And kind of like more dance beats. So it's got that EDM flavor. But then when I go to Scandroid, it is a lot of old school synthesizers, and it's, you know, when my guitar tones are not meant to be metal. I'm not tuning. I don't have a 7-string
Right.
guitar for that. I'm using like higher tunings, and it's more deliberate. FreqGen, obviously, like I've rounded that out, but it started with just kind of like analog sound design, atmospheres, beats, kind of stuff like that, and then it
Mm-hmm.
morphed into like 90s kind of thing. So, you know, I either look at the project and go, I need to do another track like that for this project. Here are my
Mm-hmm.
parameters. I'm going to do that. And I'm pretty good about staying within those boxes. In fact, much of my fan base and probably people who aren't my fans have historically like made fun of me, because what I like to do, what I love to do, and I have every right to do it because it's all me, is I get to feature my own projects on my own projects. So I'll do a Celldweller song featuring Circle of Dust, or a Scandroid song remixed by FreqGen, and I can do that because in my
Yeah.
mind, those are very different sounds, and I'm going to use a different palette. So if I do a remix of one of my projects as another project, I'm going to use a totally different palette. Although my own fans know it's me, someone from the outside who didn't know wouldn't know it was the same person. They would just think, oh,
Yeah.
this one band remixed this other band.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love that. And I think I love seeing artists do that, because there's always that, I love that exciting moment of seeing it and you actually look into it and you're like, oh shit, it's the same person. It just makes you look at the artist in a completely different way. And I think that kind of diverse sound is just, it's awesome. And there's not many artists that can do that. No, one, have the
Yeah,
skill set to do so, two, actually want to.
yeah, I think that's what it is. It's want. For me, it's just
Yeah.
desire. Like, these
It's just
projects
desire.
were born out of desire. Like, I wanted to do this. Scandroid, I
Yeah.
started, I think, 2012. I didn't even know there was a thing called synth-wave at the time. I don't even know if there was a synth-wave. It probably was just starting, but
Mm-hmm.
I've wanted to make 80s music since the 80s. Like I said, I really wasn't joking. I just wasn't talented, and I couldn't afford the gear. I couldn't afford synthesizers, samplers, anything like that. That's
How
what
do you
keeps
go
me.
about like making music? Do you make music every day? Do you go into it knowing you're going to write for Celldweller today, or how do you go about that?
There's inspiration, and then there are deadlines.
Mm-hmm.
So sadly for me, the last 5 years of my life have been the most chaotic they've ever been.
Mm-hmm.
My fans know this, or many of them do, but I made the huge mistake of uprooting my last studio and moving to Los Angeles, which was a massive mistake. I advise nobody to ever move to Los Angeles or California for that matter. It is a
I
zoo,
second
it's a
that.
circus, and the fact that we survived, meaning my wife and I and our 3 babies, borderline miracle. I don't know how I didn't go crazy. We ended up in lawsuits. The guy who was building my new studio out there, a 3 months window to finish it, and we eclipsed 2.5 years and it still wasn't done.
Yeah.
And that was just one story out of many. And there were, the crime, we lived through COVID there, which certainly didn't make things easier, because that was the worst place to be for COVID, I think, in the entire country. So all of
Definitely.
these things added up, and we bailed. We didn't even care if we were losing money on the house, which we built from scratch. It was literally a dirt lot. We
Oh
built
my
from scratch, went
God.
through that whole process, started building the studio from scratch, hit the 3-year mark almost exactly, and we literally packed our bags and we are like, we're out of here.
It's
We
like, we
didn't
need to
care.
leave.
We're gone. So the chaos of all that, some of that through that process, there may have been things I should have done as far as projects. I should have done a Celldweller thing, or I should have, but there were things I had to do to keep sane.
Yeah.
So I would make blips and bleeps on stuff like this sometimes just to keep sane. And then my manager, James, is really good about going, hey, okay, cool. Let's take that. Let's package that up and release that, as FreqGen for this thing. So there's been a fair amount, and there still is right now, a fair amount of me doing things sometimes just to keep sane. But I'm only a few months away from actually being in a real studio, and I'm going to get back to like more structure. But there are things like the Satellites, the newest Celldweller album, which happens to be right here, which is finally done.
Congratulations.
That took a long time, and that I tried to focus on as much as I could. I mentioned I wrote the impetus of all of these tracks. There's 8 of them on this album, which is really a short album for me, but a lot of that is indicative of the chaos that I've been going through for years.
Yeah.
But they were written in an 8-foot by 8-foot room, like literally a room with a laptop, a couple of hard drives, and a guitar. That's literally all I had. And I wrote all the demos, which would eventually become this album in there, because I was inspired. You know, this is the beginning of my Los Angeles trip. I did it out in the new home.
Probably exhilarating too. Just
very exhilarating. I was like, the potential, this is going to be great. Yeah, well, things don't always turn. So that's where you have to have some vision. You have to have some tenacity, and try not to lose sight of, in the midst of chaos, what am I supposed to be doing? What do I want to be doing? And it's like, even through that, like, to me, this is not my favorite Celldweller album, because when I look at it, there's a ton of pain wrapped up in this album because of what I was going through as I was writing it. Lyrics were inspired by it. You know, betrayal. Everybody's betrayed by somebody, but you know, there was a pretty substantial one up in the beginning of the Los Angeles trip. You know, that took a toll. There, you know, the building process. There was a lot of things, but just staying focused. But traditionally, before that, before I even moved, I was working on my previous Celldweller album, which is called End of an Empire. I had a ton of modular stuff, very inspired by that. And literally I said, every 3 months, I'm putting out 2 songs, 2 instrumentals. There'll be remixes. And I'm doing these things called factions, which are basically, they're not remixes. They're reinterpretations of the songs that I'm doing. So I was doing basically EPs every 3 months, which is fast for me. I'm not a producer who does a track in 2 days. My tracks are very complex, very progressive, very layered. Mixing is a chore, and I was doing everything from A to Z myself. And because I was unmarried, had my business in my place, so my employees would come to me and work while I was in my studio creating, I just could focus, and I did productivity. Head down, like face down and pushing through. That was one of my lyrics, and that was what I did. Yeah, productivity. I'm like, I'm going to hit a level of productivity I've never had in my life, and that's true. That was the most productive I've ever been. And then I uprooted, moved to LA, and now I've been completely derailed. So for me, the jury's out whether or not when I get into my new studio, am I going to be able to get back to that now that I have 3 little, you know, toddlers and a lot of other responsibilities. So we'll see. That's the plan. But
I hope so. Maybe, you know, the stability, at least, of being in an environment that you're familiar with and just comfortable with will be helpful. Out of all of your albums, which one did you enjoy creating the most, or at least felt the most just dedicated to and just loved it?
I mean, I'm dedicated to all of them. Like I am definitely like dyed in the wool. Like, I'm not going to release a song if I think it sucks.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's people out there that think my music sucks and thinks the songs I make suck. And I have artists that I love, and I think some songs that they make suck. So everybody has their opinion, and everybody's entitled to them. Yeah. But as long as I like it, I'll put it out. So that's actually, it's hard for me to say one album. There's probably 2, and I can say them briefly. The first Celldweller album, because that was fresh.
That was your debut album?
Yeah. The debut Celldweller album. There was no pressure. I left New York. I didn't move from New York. I just left New York to come to Michigan, because this is how I ended up here. It's because a friend of mine, Grant Mormon, had opened up a studio, needed a guinea pig as he was working out the kinks. I was broke, and I'm like, and he's like, I'll give you a great rate. So I came out thinking I was going to be here for 3 weeks, spent 6 months. And the music that came out of there ended up getting me a much larger deal, a record deal, which ended up failing before the album came out, and they wanted all their money back. It's a long story. It should have ended my career, but it did. But those moments, the time that we made the album, becoming friends, you know, our similarities, the focus on the music. He taught me things, I taught him things, and there was no pressure. It was just like we were eating Arby's and Reese's Puff cereal because we were broke, and we'd buy a box of cereal and we'd have to milk it throughout the whole day, so we had enough food to eat for a day. That's just the way it was, and we loved it. It was awesome.
It was a very successful. I mean, that album also, not only did it probably kickstart your career, but it was a very successful album. Like, take a second to appreciate how, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't it debut number 17 on Billboards? Like, that must have been quite a,
at that time, a completely independent artist. That was
exactly not common
and
at
every
all.
song on that album ultimately ended up getting licensed multiple times for either film, TV, video games.
Wow.
And I went into this never having licensed anything. Like,
It was your first album, right? First
first
album.
album, right?
Wow,
So,
that must have been
so
quite
I
the
didn't
feeling.
even know the licensing world. It just showed that what I was imagining in my mind, which is why I felt like I was a really good fit for Universe, is because you could describe to me a world or a setting, as long as it's in something in a world that I love, which is sci-fi and aliens and technology and future and dystopia, those kinds of things. I can paint those pictures in my head easily, and the music that I created naturally was an extension of those visuals that I had in my head. I was writing songs for movies that didn't exist because they existed only in my brain at the time, but then they ended up aligning with, you know, the movie industry and the video game industry without me even knowing.
Wow.
And then the album I just mentioned, which was End of an Empire, I did that album completely on my own in my last studio before I moved to LA, where I had a ton of this stuff. I was really into modular stuff, and I was using that. It was very inspiring to me. So lots of different production techniques. I had my SSL console, and I had 7 days a week, 365 days a year to focus on that. I literally worked 7 days a week, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I loved it. That was my reason to get up in the morning. So those are the two, for me, most memorable and iconic albums. The other albums were just as important. You know, the sound of them probably has morphed for various reasons, but just, you know, due to time, but all in all, yeah, I mean, I'm just glad that I got to make those albums and have those experiences, and I'm looking forward to making a lot more music, and hope to have good experiences making those as well.
Yeah, definitely. I want to talk a little bit about your work with games, movies. Has there been a project that you work with that's really challenged you? You said you're good at, you know, imagining worlds, and really, you know, there's a difference between writing your own music for yourself, for your own artist brand, and writing a soundtrack. For those that aren't familiar with music, because I think a lot of people watching aren't really familiar with the industry. Very different. Very, very, very different. How do you go about writing soundtracks? How do you go about selecting the kind of soundtracks or the projects you actually want to work with?
Well, one that I can think, I mean, like I said earlier, I just finished up working on the Borderlands movie, which is not out yet. I think that's still in progress. And that was a challenge, but not the most challenging. One of the most challenging that I can think of offhand is I get a call from my friend Tom Salta, who is a composer. He's worked on the Halo franchise. He's a video game composer, among other things. I've known him for years and years and years. And he called me one day and he's like, "Hey, do you know anybody who might be interested in maybe taking on this video game?" It was an arcade game in the 90s. It's called Killer Instinct. And I was like, Killer Instinct? I'm like, it's Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct, kind of the same, those same kind of worlds, you know? And he's like, I'm going to be doing this project, but I want to bring somebody on. And I'm like, thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? I might be interested in this. He's like, oh man, I was hoping you would say that. Let's talk. So we did, and we talked about it. And Microsoft brought us both on to do that. Like they wanted Tom to do the thing. And he's like, we need a rock star involved, which is literally what he said to me. I'm not calling myself one. He called me that, and he pitched it to Microsoft. He's like, I'm going to bring this rock star in. We did meetings, and we did kind of a test. Kim Woo was the character, I believe. We did a test piece for. We did a little short, like 2-minute thing. Microsoft came back and were like, this is great. So we went into maybe it was 15 characters. I don't remember, but the writing process, it's not like writing a song. We were writing about 8 or 9 minutes of music per character times 12 or 15 characters. I don't know. It was months and months of work.
Wow.
And they were extremely diverse. You had a vampire that lived underground, and then you had like a frog, you know, like from what was the video game? I'm trying to remember the game. I can't remember the game. But the frog, I can't believe I'm blanking out, but he was like an 80s icon. The actually he came from a video game. So we wanted to do like 80s metal guitar leads and 80s production. And then we had like another character that was more of a John Carpenter reference, like old like horror John Carpenter. So it was like synthesizers and dark tones, orchestral stuff. I mean, it was like, you know, there was a Halo character that was involved. So Tom, being in the Halo universe, brought a lot of the Halo themes, and then I put my vibe to it. Kim Woo, when we did the fleshed out Kim Woo, it was like Celldweller style, like live bass and guitars and stuff mixed with like Asian. Tom had recorded someone he knew over in New York that played an instrument, that the stringed instrument, I believe it was a Japanese instrument. And she came in, or maybe it was Korean, and she played this thing, and then we laid that over the top. It was very eclectic. We recorded live orchestra. So Tom and I are essentially, I think it was Skype. We were Skyping at the time, watching this orchestra somewhere in Macedonia, I believe it was. live, just doing this, the score that we put together. It was incredible, great experience, but very challenging because we'd write the stuff, go to Microsoft, Zach over at Microsoft, and Zach would come back and be like, okay, guys, great, but, and then he'd give some notes. And these things had to be written in very small chunks because when you're playing a game, that chunk might loop a bunch of times before it goes to the next chunk. And the whole idea is that it can be seamless. So we write an 8-minute, 9-minute song, have to chop that into 4 to 8 bars that any one of them, if you butted them up, had to act fluid. They had to be fluid. So, because that's how the game works. There are engines built into modern gaming that dynamically move stems around. The whole idea is you don't want glitches and gaps. It has to feel smooth. So there was a huge learning curve there for us. But it was very exciting. I think Tom and I both would look back and be like, it was a great experience. We really enjoyed working with each other, really enjoyed completing the project. It was my excuse to buy an Xbox because I don't really game. And I think I launched a game. That was probably the last time I ever launched Xbox, but it was great. It was a great experience.
That's incredible. I mean, I can't imagine being in that kind of a room and having so many structural limitations in terms of like the actual product you need to create. It needs to work a specific way. I think for many people it's very limiting, and trying to create something that's, you know, musically comfortable or at least representative of your sound.
Yeah, right.
But limited by so many different things. I mean, that's a huge challenge. Huge challenge.
A problem that needs to be solved.
But a problem that needs to be solved.
And the beauty of something like that for me, because I am eclectic and I'm driven by diversity. I'm not, I just can't be a guitar, bass, and drums guy. I knew that like really early on in my career. It just bored me. Like I need diversity. And so diverse sounds and now diverse characters. These characters have their own sound. We made a track for a Viking, a character that was a Viking. So we actually went and referenced old Viking songs and modern Viking music, and we you know, guitar-based music and these chants and all this kinds of stuff. And we pulled that off. It was very like exciting. Limiting on one hand, but the limitations are what was exciting about it. And the idea that we had to solve these problems, you know?
Yeah. And there's not many people that could do that. Here's a question, purely because you said, you know, you were writing for a Viking, for a specific Viking, and you were sampling music from, looking at music from that time as references. What's your opinion on sampling?
Well, my opinion doesn't matter anymore, but back in the day when it was Circle of Dust, I mean, that's like every industrial band. I grew up in, like, I'm a New Yorker, and I grew up in New York, and the New York industrial scene was pretty big and pretty violent and really cool. And quite honestly, I never cared about being part of it. I didn't really tour much in New York. I toured everywhere else in the US, played in New York once in a while, but I didn't care about being the biggest local band because I was thinking much bigger than local. But the sound was sampling. It was like you sampled from movies. And, you know, I wasn't much like sampling riffs from other people's records. It was more about like the movies. And that's why my brain, I saw visuals. I saw environments. I saw worlds that my music was kind of part of. And I was actually taking those worlds and bringing them into my music. But through the 90s, and especially into the early 2000s, the law had finally caught up to sampling, as many people know, and you can't touch anything with a 10-foot pole without the prospect of litigation. So I knew even that early, I'm like, I am backing off sampling from movies and things like that. And I have to go into like, I'll many times create my own sounds, but I wanted to sample the dialogue bits and the sound effects. But I really, my music moved away from that anyway. And I just ended up creating my own sound design. Stuff like this is just, you know, you could be making sound design here for endless opportunities. So the modern version of sampling, I know like hip hop and things, there's a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm asking because just like today's music, I mean, it's honestly, I hear a record, I can hear another one, and I can name you 3 that sound just like it.
I mean, for me personally, it's like if that's what you want to do and that inspires you, cool. For me, there's something cool about like sampling somebody, but it's so common, and to me, it's just less original. Yeah, I'd rather just make something original. I'd rather make music that maybe somebody else samples someday. You know, who knows?
That's a great way to think about it. You're talking about solving problems, and I wanted to talk a little bit about your label, Fixed. Why did you decide to create your label? I know that when I looked into you guys a little bit, you talk about its guiding principles being based on, you know, inherent issues in the industry and trying to solve them and provide opportunities for other writers, producers, publishers. But you guys serve as publishing. Why did you decide to create your label, and what are some of those problems that you wanted to target?
Survival. I created my label for survival because I had been through so many bad deals, and every one of them should have ended my career. My first record deal, I was in a lawsuit for 1.5 years. tied me up. I couldn't release any music and I couldn't sign
Oh
anywhere else. And I had to
no.
pay for an attorney I couldn't afford. I was broke. I was completely broke. Survived it, continued, and then I got that big record deal. It was really a major record deal. I got a really huge advance in money, more money than I'd ever seen in my whole life to pay off the debt that I had put myself in to get there. Yeah. And I was the only artist they had signed before 9/11 happened. The economy started to tank, and they were like, you know what? We actually changed our mind. We're not going to do a label. Give us all that money back. Oh, I can't because I paid myself out of debt. And they're like, okay, well, the music that you're making as Celldweller, we're going to dock that. So really a lot of my early licensing that I was doing for movies, which I had never seen before in my life, it was all new to me. And, I'm landing movie trailers for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, huge amount of money. And I was getting a tiny fraction of that money in my own pocket because a majority of it was going to pay off the debt. So I was paying them back at the same time. I needed to come up with more money to finish a record. I mean, it was just all about survival for me. So
cycle.
Yeah, cycle. And so I lived through that. And what happened is I started realizing, like, I was doing my own artwork. I was figuring out how to get it. Tyler Bacon from Position was my manager at the time. So between the two of us, we were figuring out, how do we make t-shirts? How do we get a CD made? The debut Celldweller album, I started by putting a lot of that artwork together, and then we ended up bringing a few other people in to bring it all together. But I did almost everything myself in the beginning because I didn't have the money and we didn't know anybody that could do it. Survival. So knowing that and learning how to do that, I realized, like, why am I going to go out and try? This is when the MP3 now has started taking off. Major labels were starting to fold. They were starting to panic. Large artists were starting to get kicked off their throne, and you saw them panicking. And I was at that point in time going, like, why would I want to be on a label? I'm doing this. I'm surviving, and I control everything. I own everything. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. And I'm not the type of guy, personally, that likes to be told what to do. I've never been that type of guy. I like to do what I like to do, and that's it. I'm just fairly opinionated dude. So I knew that I wanted to figure out how to survive as an independent artist. And then it was a natural extension to me to be like, what other artists do I know that could benefit from the same information that I'm sorting for myself, making their albums, distributing them, making merchandise. My brother was a prime example. So one of my brothers made music, but he didn't know how to distribute it or do anything else. And I'm like, let's go to Dan, like, let's get sign level, put the stuff out. And that really was the gateway. We didn't do much beyond that with him, but that was the gateway to, like, man, we can extend this. And James Rhodes, who's now VP of the company, he was basically volunteering for me for like 2 years as not even an employee. He was just like a fan. And I gave him stuff to do. And he eventually became an employee. Maybe I paid him $100 a week because I was broke. And he was so passionate. He's like, I'll take $100 a week if it means I can stay involved. And then there's the story. It just grew and grew and grew. We're now at over 20 employees. The label is the biggest and best it's ever been, both within the roster and the staff. We're the most focused we've ever been. So it's, if people were to look and be like, wow, overnight success, like, this overnight success is like 30 years and counting.
It's never an overnight success. Nothing is ever an overnight success. Like, no. I hate when people say that because it makes my blood boil, because it's never like that. Ever. And I think anything that is an overnight success, if it did happen within them, maybe there are some things like a video going viral. How long is that going to last?
Right. And as soon as it goes up, it goes back down. That was my Spice Girls thing. Because back then in the 90s or 2000, whenever they were big, someone made that connection with me. Like, would you want to be the Spice Girls, or would you rather be just like an underground band that just kind of grows slowly? I'm like, underground band.
Well,
like,
what do you want your success to be? That's not success to you. Yeah. I'm
like, they're just marketing and money. And the second that dries up, they're going to be the butt of every joke. It was all about money and marketing. Yeah. So for me, that was the path. So it's really Fixed was born from me having to survive and surviving 3 bad deals that I can mention right now. Like three record deals that I had, which were the only 3 I ever had, all ended in failure. Terrible. They were all catastrophes. They were, in the moment I was like, this is going to end me. I don't know how I'm going to survive this.
It's incredible that you made that decision to just take it in your hands and start your own label. Because I think especially back then, that you had to have a label. I mean, that was just the notion of you had to succeed, to release music, to get onto radio, to get the press you deserve, to actually get that exposure, go on tour. You just needed that money. You see now with the way with social media and everything, artists really don't need it. You see so many artists choosing to go independent, choosing to start their own labels. I still see people going into shitty deals. I mean, I've been offered shitty deals and I just didn't take them. I was lucky enough to be, you know, educated early enough to not do that, to understand that I don't have to do that. And you know, I think we live in a different time as well.
Paramount deciding factor
Mm-hmm.
for me as an artist getting screwed by labels to be a label. And that is fair deals. Like, we're partners. Like, from day one, we were doing 50-50 deals. Nobody was doing 50-50. I've never signed a 50-50 deal in my life. My first record deal was like a 92.8, I think. I think I was getting 8% of every album sold, which was that 8 cents for a $10 album, a cassette at the time, was going to recoup money that they claimed they spent promoting me, that I had no way to prove that they spent that money. It was so crooked and corrupt, and all of my deals were like that.
Yeah.
And James and I in the beginning were like, we're not doing deals like that at all. Like, these are going to be fair deals.
It's sad because there's still deals like that today.
We're signing artists right now that are coming out of deals that are like 82-18s and things like that. And they're 5-piece bands. How are you ever, and then they're paying managers and booking agents. How are you going to ever survive? You're never going to survive.
How are you going to ever survive? And I think for me, the thing I always like flagged to me was so early on was like, it's your masters. Like, God forbid you ever sign off your masters to anybody.
Well, you know, to be perfectly blunt, we sign masters. We own masters and control them. And the reason is because that allows us to generate way more money. When you start having people controlling things like that or owning it, there are a lot of artists that don't understand. I was one of them. I didn't understand. So if someone came to me and be like, hey, we need your permission because they want to license this song for this thing, I would have been like, no. And I would have killed that deal. But at the end of the day, in perpetuity, for as long as we own a master, that artist is making 50% of any money we generate. So there's never a situation where someday it ends and we're keeping 100% and we screw the artist out of their deal. It's just, that's not how our arrangements are built. So I think it's a misconception where people are running around, and I've seen a lot of it. Don't sell your masters. Don't sell your publishing. That's because they don't understand. And to be fair, there are a lot of labels that take advantage of that. So I understand why people are saying don't do it, because there's a lot of examples of why you should never do that. But, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, people have to understand. And again, this is me coming from that world. Like, I came from that, and that's why we're doing it, because I understand this. And really, at the end of the day, we explained to any artist that has an issue with this, understand that in perpetuity, we're 50-50 partners in any music we have. You owning it probably means that you're, even if our deal was done and you took those masters, the reality is you're going to generate way less on them, because we have spent literally decades opening doors, creating relationships. We have worldwide distro. We have worldwide sync capabilities, you know, synchronization, like licensing for film, TV, video,
of course,
those kinds of things. That individual, because I was an individual, I was this person, I couldn't do it. I've been in some really major video games because of position and Tyler, because Tyler was my manager. I was basically the guinea pig in the beginning with Tyler, and I ended up landing some pretty big video game things because he was opening the doors for me.
I really respect you talking.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, if that hadn't happened, I may not be sitting here right now.
Yeah, I really respect you bringing up masters in this kind of, I think, context, and explaining to people what it actually means and what you can do with it. And I think people miss out on so many opportunities when it comes to sync, any kind of licensing deal. I think they underestimate how much money you can actually make from having your song featured in an episode of a TV show. Especially up and coming artists that don't get the advantage of going to school and learning about it, or, you know, growing up in an environment where they're surrounded by people and they're all really in the industry and understanding how it works and the back end of it. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think a lot of people, like the way I mentioned, the way I was even, like, you know, I guess not necessarily taught, but assumed is, you know, you hear the word masters and you just like protect your own work, like immediately our alarm bells ring, because that's just the most standard issue you hear, right?
It comes back to the trust thing. And of course you don't expect an artist to meet a label and be like, oh, I trust you, but you can see our track record. And there are other labels that are stand up. I mean, there are labels that do what they say. They're fair to the artists. But there are a lot of labels that are not. And that's why people hear this and their reaction, people running around saying, don't sell your masters, don't sell your publishing. They don't even really understand what that means. They just hear other artists saying it, and they think that they're getting ahead in their career by sticking to that advice when they don't even understand what it really
protecting
means.
their work. But it's like, are you protecting your work from it being abused or it being used? You know what
no
I
one's
mean?
ever going to hear it. Exactly. You're
Exactly.
protecting it from anyone ever getting it heard. And I am not saying sign with us and we're going to do everything. Like we don't even, we're very selective about who we sign. But the point is, like, as an artist, anybody listening who has that aspiration, vet out a label. Don't just go, I'm never going to do that. Vet it out. You can't get pregnant from talking. Go talk. Let them pitch. Let them pitch their thing to you. But if you don't feel comfortable, walk away. Simple as that. You don't need to do anything. But if you don't even entertain that, you don't even know what you're missing. And the reality is, I mean, I can show you data from Fixed of where we signed artists that had 1 to 200 monthly listeners on Spotify when we signed them. And in the period of a year or two, have eclipsed 100 to 200,000 monthly listeners. And that didn't happen because they just had their music up and they didn't sign a record deal. That happened because when we signed them, we went into full-blown work mode to make the connections, to figure out how to market it, to playlist. I mean, in the early days of Spotify, we were literally individually hitting people that were making playlists directly because you could do that.
People don't realize
so
editorial is such a huge, they just
huge undertaking. This is not like I grew up in the era where you signed a record deal. They took all your money and they sat back and smoked cigars and laughed about how much money they were making, and you were out there starving. This is not that era, and I am not that person. Like, my character would never allow me to do that or be that person.
I really respect that. It's really enlightening to hear and have this kind of conversation just, as a young artist. And I think everybody else listening, any young artists, especially musicians, these are really, really important things. And I think conversations that don't, you hear them happening, but
I think you hear
never in this kind of a raw, like, it's never in this kind of a purely based off experience and genuine just facts. Like, it's factual. It's not, I think I should do this. You've lived through it. And I think I wish more artists would speak up about it. I mean, it's difficult because sometimes you can't speak about it because you're contractually obliged to not talk about it. So I really respect you talking about it, and thank you. I want to shift a little bit towards the universe and how you came across it. First of all, you've worked with Josh. Everybody in our community knows Josh. And you guys worked on Blackstar. Can you tell us what Blackstar is? How did that project come to be?
Well, again, like I have always, I can't help myself. When I write an album, it's a concept, and there's these threads throughout the songs. So, the artwork, and there are so many extensions outside of just my music. And somewhere along the line, we had published The Bane of Yoda, which is a book that Josh wrote.
Yep.
And he didn't have a publisher at the time, so he came to us, even though we were a label. But we really liked Josh, just on a personal level. Like, let's try to help him. And it was before too long, he was able to do more than we were, because we really were a record label, not a book publisher. And now he has Hex Publishing, which is doing great things. But at the time, that helped us develop the relationship. I don't remember exactly how it happened. And Josh may or may not remember himself either, but it was just a natural conversation. I wanted a bigger property around the story of my album, Wish Upon a Blackstar, because it was an entire concept there. I had characters and this lore, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And somehow or another, we connected the dots, and Josh was like, let me write this. Like, I'll write a novel. And I was like, can you do that? Like, I've never done this, so I didn't even know it was really possible. And really jumping into it, it was a lot of work. Not just, he had the bulk of the work, obviously, to do, but like reading revisions of scripts that were this thick. Like, I'd have to carve out a couple of days where I wasn't making music or taking meetings, because I was reading fine print, making notes. Let's change this. So that was really that wasn't the beginning of our history, but that was one that really cemented our relationship, in the sense that, like, working together, we liked working together, and
good dynamic.
The product we were really, really proud of. And then I went on to, it was one of the first things, I think, one of the first musical things I had done that was kind of starting to hint at that 80s sound, using like modular synths and synthesizers. I wanted to write a score to the book. So I wanted to create instrumental music. So if you were reading the book, this instrumental music became the background for what you were reading, and the titles all reflected moments in the book, like Into the Outlands, which was this dark, barren place, and the song was kind of dark and evil sounding. And then there was just lighter kind of stuff that represented other moments in the book. Whether people made those connections, I don't know. I cared, and I did it for me again. So an album that I made, Wish Upon a Blackstar, spawned the book Blackstar, which spawned the score Blackstar. So it was this these
So
properties that
sick.
just kept growing, and then fan fiction, and like it just kept expanding, and the artwork and things like that. Yeah, there was a lot involved, and it was really exciting. But I've known Josh for a really long time, and he, of course, is the guy who rang my phone relatively recently and was like, "I need to tell you about the universe." I'm like, "Tell me."
So what was your first impression?
Well, my first impression was the explanation of what it was, and it's highly exciting, obviously. The people that were involved, including him, obviously. Um, uh, the storyline, the technology of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot involved, and then the fact that for him it was just as important to make sure that the music
Yeah.
told another part of that story.
Yeah.
So I saw some rough early cuts of the trailer, which then even cemented further in my mind what this world was going to be. He described to me some of the things over the phone and some of the
Yeah.
lore and some of the characters, and I already like had a sense of what this trailer could sound like. Then seeing some visuals that
That's
a lot of times
impressive.
they were just still, the gray matte,
Yeah. I mean, there was
unfinished.
really not much. There isn't
Right. Wasn't
really,
much.
it doesn't exist yet, right? Like technically,
Right.
visually.
So it was, for me, a very natural extension, which is why I think Josh came to me. Like, it's a very natural extension of what my career has always been. I make music and sounds to worlds and movies that don't exist. They exist in my head, and that's why I do them. I'm chasing this grander vision. Like I don't know how to describe it, and I'm not trying to be arrogant about it. I'm not saying I'm great or I have these great ideas. It's just the way my brain works. I have always been audiovisual, and I make music, but it's, from, like we talked about, sampling. My early album, Circle of Dust, I sampled from movies because I wanted that aesthetic in my music.
Yep.
When I stopped sampling from the movies, my music became that aesthetic that told that story that didn't even really exist. So I've always seen images and characters and visuals that didn't exist. Like End of an Empire, which again was one of my favorite albums to make. I did a comic book around that album. Tons of artwork. There's this is when I found my artist Ninja Joe, who is in Ukraine. She is the most amazing artist. She found me. I can't give myself credit for finding her. She came to me, couldn't believe how talented this girl was. And I started giving her some things to do in my world. And that became a really thick art book around that album. Characters fully sketched out, with backstories and plot lines, and the comic book that tells the story of this traveler. And he goes through time, love, dreams, and death. There were 4 chapters to the album. Those 2, I don't remember how, maybe 2 or 3 songs per chapter, and each one of them represented an empire, end of an empire, love, time, dreams, and death. And there were characters around them. So if you see that artwork, you would realize that it's not really far from what something like Universe is doing. There are characters, and they live in this alternate reality on different worlds that we don't know, with technology we will never experience in our lifetime, things like that. So when Joshua explained it to me, I was like, A, I get it. B, I'm super excited. C, when do we start?
I think it's impressive just how your imagination works to do that, because it's not an easy thing to basically envision an entire world and so quickly hear what it sounds like. I mean, I think any person would look at that and be like, how do you do that?
It's a process. I mean, it's not like I sit down and in 20 minutes I have an entire album and story.
Of course not.
So, one informs the other. I might write a piece of music and be like, this feels like this kind of character. Or I have this idea, like, there's this guy and he controls time. All right, I'm going to write some music revolving around this story of this character that controls time and what that represents. So they inform the lyrics, which informs the story, and it's a back and forth. So through the process of writing an album, writing a book, writing a comic, writing fleshing out an art book, all of this stuff is just constantly fleshed out, and the story grows, and you try to keep the continuity there. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But I'm always up for that challenge. I love it.
Your album Satellites just came out. Is there anything, what can we look forward to from Celldweller in the next few months, years?
Well, I mentioned several times Borderlands. So whenever the Borderlands movie comes out, go check that out. You'll hear my stuff all over that. I am currently starting a new Scandroid, which is one of my 80s, 90s project. A new cycle there. I already have, I probably have 30 or 40 demos written, but getting into vocals and lyrics. And now, little bit of inside baseball here. I'm going to give some people some inside information that we haven't shared much with the rest of the world, but Josh is currently working on a novella for the Scandroid album. So there's going to be a novella based around this new space that we're taking the Scandroid story. Pretty excited about it. And
that's
that
awesome.
will, again, inform the lyrics. It'll inform the music informs the story, and it will become this bigger property. And we have some other really big, cool ideas we're discussing. But I'll leave it at that tiny little bit.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'm so excited to see that. I just love the idea of taking your music being more than just the sound. And I think I'm excited for music too. I think overall the industry is going to start gearing towards that direction a little bit more. I'm curious how it's going to go. I don't think a lot of, especially in mainstream music, you don't really tend to see that. So I'm excited to definitely see that from you. And I hope that the industry will hopefully shift towards there.
My advice to anyone even thinking along those lines is be true to you. Don't worry about anybody else. Don't worry about if they're going to like it or hate it. They'll let you know. Don't worry. This is the internet. They will let you know if they hate it. And very rarely if they like it. It's only ever hate, which is why I'm totally off social media. I hate social media. Yeah, I hate it. I hate social media. If you want to bruise your ego and have like no reason to be alive, just stay on social media. All it is bad.
So sick.
Doubt. Yeah. So I don't care. I literally don't care. Create your art, put it out, and move on to the next thing. But if you want to create a story around your world, do it. There's no reason why you can't. Just do it for you. Don't do it for the expectation of like, I got to do this because other people are doing this, or I think it's going to do that. You have to be true to yourself.
So what was your first yourself as an artist, impression?
Musically, visually, on any level, you will find your audience over time, and it will take time, but you will find them. And a lot of times this audience will hold on to you and they won't let go because they love what you do, because they found you. And I'm fortunate to say that I have some really great fans that I don't know why they're still with me. I don't know why they still love what I do. And I'm not complaining. If you don't know how to start, I'll give you very clear advice. Yep. Go find a track that you like and try to imitate it. I'm not telling you to imitate it, rip it off and put it out because you'll get sued, but try to imitate it through that process. Celldweller, Circle of Dust, all of my projects really were me chasing sounds in my head. The difference is I'm amalgamating 20, 30, 40 artists, and they all get jumbled in my head. So what comes out doesn't sound like I'm trying to rip off one artist. I don't think there's any artist that couldn't point to their influence, of course. So we all have influences. If you don't know where to start, try taking something that exists and go, how did they make that sound? Let me dig around and try. You know what? We're in the world of YouTube tutorials. There's a million tutorials to show you how to do it. There's no more excuses of why you can't. So go try it. And what happens is if you do and you succeed in making something that you like, now that opens up the door for you to go, oh, I can do this. And then you start, the more you do this, the more original your sounds will be, the more you're infusing other influences, and then you just need to start getting it out there. And eventually it will get into the hands of somebody that'll be like, okay, I know how to get this into a movie or a video.